Jim Bakker was born in 1940 in Muskegon, Michigan, the son of a factory worker and a mother devoted to the Pentecostal faith. His childhood was ordinary, even austere. Yet from the time he was a teenager, he was fascinated by the way preachers could move crowds, the rhythm of their voices, the tears they could summon, the certainty with which they described heaven and hell. That fascination, combined with a keen eye for opportunity, would propel him to the center of America's television faith revolution and ultimately destroy him. In the 1960s, Bakker attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis, where he met Tammy Faye LaValle, a lively, musically gifted young woman whose humor and emotional sincerity balanced his ambition. The pair married quickly and began preaching as traveling evangelists. They used humor, music, and theatrical storytelling to hold audiences. By the end of the decade, the couple had found a niche that blended entertainment with religion, a style that would make them famous. In 1966, the Bakkers joined Pat Robertson's fledgling Christian broadcasting network. Their puppet skits and musical segments became staples of the 700 Club, one of the first shows to bring evangelical Christianity into American living rooms. The mix of prayer, personality, and polished production proved magnetic. Jim learned how lighting, camera angles, and emotion could turn sermons into television events. He also learned the power of the ask, the moment when viewers were invited to give. By the mid-1970s, Bakker and his wife launched their own program, the PTL Club, Praise the Lord, or People That Love. Broadcast first from Virginia and later from North Carolina, PTL exploded in popularity. It offered an upbeat, positive version of faith that promised viewers joy, prosperity, and divine favor. Unlike the fiery sermons of earlier decades, Bakker's message was soft, conversational, and relentlessly optimistic. If you trusted God and donated generously, blessings would follow. Money flowed in. Millions of Americans mailed checks to PTL, believing they were supporting missions, outreach, and a new kind of Christian media. Behind the scenes, the Bakkers expanded rapidly. Studios, satellite links, publishing arms, and a vast mail-order network. At its peak, PTL aired on nearly 200 stations and reached an estimated 13 million viewers. The Bakkers became celebrities. Their pastel-colored sets, emotional prayers, and variety show atmosphere felt more like daytime television than church. And that was the point. Religion had become entertainment, and entertainment had become immensely profitable. In 1978, Bakker unveiled his grandest vision yet, Heritage USA, a 2,500-acre Christian theme park in Fort Mill, South Carolina. Part retreat, part resort, and part pilgrimage site, Heritage USA was to be a Christian Disneyland, complete with hotels, a water park, and daily worship events. Bakker told followers it would be a sanctuary for believers during the end times, a place of joy and community financed entirely through faith. Donations poured in again. Viewers bought lifetime memberships, which promised annual lodging at the resort in exchange for one-time contributions, often hundreds or thousands of dollars. But as construction expanded, so did the cost. Financial controls were loose and accountability almost non-existent. Former employees later described a culture of excess, private jets, luxury cars, wardrobes worth tens of thousands of dollars. Heritage USA's bookkeeping blurred the line between ministry funds and personal spending. Bakker insisted it was all for God's glory. Critics saw an empire built on guilt and television charisma. By the mid-1980s, PTL was pulling in over $120 million a year, more than some Hollywood studios. Yet the cracks had begun to show. Auditors warned of mounting debts and questionable accounting. Former staffers reported that money earmarked for missions was being used for personal luxuries and to keep the theme park afloat. The couple's on-air pleas for emergency donations became increasingly urgent. "The devil is trying to destroy this ministry," Bakker warned viewers, "but your pledge of $1,000 will stop him." Then in 1987, the mask slipped. Investigative reporters discovered that Bakker had secretly paid $265,000 in hush money to a former church secretary, Jessica Hahn. The payment, routed through ministry accounts, was intended to silence allegations that Bakker had coerced her into a sexual encounter in a Florida hotel years earlier. When the Charlotte Observer broke the story, it detonated across the country. The man who had built an empire on purity and faith was accused of moral and financial corruption. Bakker resigned from PTL almost immediately, claiming he was the victim of a hostile takeover by rival televangelist Jerry Falwell. Falwell temporarily assumed control of PTL, promising to stabilize the ministry. But what he found inside the books was staggering: tens of millions in debt, extravagant spending, and evidence of widespread misuse of donor funds. Federal investigators soon became involved. In 1989, Bakker was indicted on 24 counts of mail and wire fraud and conspiracy. Prosecutors alleged that he had defrauded tens of thousands of followers by overselling lifetime partnerships at Heritage, promising accommodations that did not exist, and using the money to enrich himself. The total fraud exceeded $150 million. The trial drew enormous media attention. Day after day, cameras captured the fallen preacher arriving at court, clutching a Bible, sometimes weeping, sometimes defiant. Witnesses described a ministry where loyalty to Bakker outweighed ethics, where questioning financial decisions was considered rebellion against God. Accountants testified about shredded documents and secret bonuses. The government portrayed Bakker as a man who confused God's work with his own indulgence. Bakker's defense argued that he had been overwhelmed by success, that he never intended to defraud anyone, only to build something great for God. He insisted he was naive about finances, surrounded by staff who mishandled details. But jurors saw something else: a pattern of deliberate deception and reckless extravagance. In October 1989, Bakker was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and a $500,000 fine, the harshest sentence ever imposed on a televangelist at the time. The image of Bakker, once polished and smiling, being led away in handcuffs became one of the defining moments of late 20th century American religion. For millions of believers, it was a shattering moment. The man who promised heaven on television had been revealed as a symbol of greed and hypocrisy. Heritage USA closed, PTL collapsed, and the prosperity gospel industry faced a crisis of credibility. In prison, Bakker's life changed dramatically. His wife Tammy Faye divorced him. She would later remarry and rebuild a modest television career. Bakker spent nearly 5 years behind bars before his sentence was reduced on appeal, and he was released in 1994. During that time, he claimed to experience a spiritual rebirth, reading the Bible daily and rejecting the prosperity doctrine that had once made him rich. He wrote a book, I Was Wrong, confessing to pride and materialism, though critics questioned how deep the repentance went. After his release, Bakker gradually returned to broadcasting. By the 2000s, he was hosting a new show from Missouri, The Jim Bakker Show, focusing on end-times prophecy and selling survivalist food supplies. To some, it was evidence that he had never truly changed, only found a new product to sell. To others, it showed a man trying to rebuild a ministry after losing everything. Yet the legacy of PTL and Heritage USA remains a defining cautionary tale. Bakker's empire was built on genuine charisma and real faith among followers, but it thrived in an environment with no transparency and no accountability. The system rewarded emotional appeal over honesty and spectacle over service. When that system collapsed, it left behind not only financial ruin, but spiritual disillusionment for thousands who had believed that giving to God guaranteed prosperity. Sociologists studying the scandal point out that Bakker's downfall reflected a broader American pattern: the merging of faith with consumerism. In an era of television evangelism, religion had become a brand, and preachers like Bakker were its CEOs. They marketed hope the way corporations marketed products, complete with logos, jingles, and testimonials. When hope itself became transactional, corruption was inevitable. For the survivors, those who lost savings, faith, or both, the story still stings. Some never returned to organized religion. Others found smaller community-based churches that emphasized accountability. And for those who still defend Bakker, the argument is that his original message of joy and forgiveness was corrupted not by theology, but by the temptations of power. Jim Bakker's tale is not simply about one man's fall. It is about a culture that rewarded excess in the name of God. He remains, decades later, a polarizing figure, part warning, part curiosity, part relic of an era when television promised salvation for the price of a phone call. Reflection. The story of Jim Bakker strips away the glittering surface of televangelism to reveal the fragile line between faith and fraud. It asks viewers to consider how easily trust can be monetized and how charisma can disguise greed until the mask finally cracks. Behind the lights and music, a simple truth emerges. When religion becomes a business, the soul of belief is the first casualty. In the late 1990s, Eddie Lee Long stood at the height of American evangelical influence. His voice filled megachurches, his suits gleamed on television, and his words commanded the attention of politicians and athletes alike. He was the spiritual father to tens of thousands, and the face of a new kind of ministry, one that fused old-school gospel thunder with modern swagger. He preached prosperity, discipline, and purity. His congregation saw him as a prophet. But behind the polished sermons and luxury cars, another truth waited. A truth that would eventually destroy the empire he had built. Eddie Long was born in 1953 in Charlotte, North Carolina, the son of a Baptist minister and a schoolteacher. His childhood was steeped in the rhythms of church life, choirs, prayer meetings, Sunday school. But he also saw the constraints of small-town ministry, poverty, long hours, little recognition. He dreamed of something larger. After college at North Carolina Central University, he earned a degree in business administration, then joined Ford Motor Company as a sales trainee. Corporate life taught him how to motivate people, sell visions, and project confidence, all skills that would later translate seamlessly into preaching. In the early 1980s, Long answered what he described as a divine call. He left the corporate world and began studying theology. His charisma was immediate. Within a few years, he was appointed pastor of New Birth Missionary Baptist Church, a small suburban congregation in Lithonia, Georgia, with fewer than 300 members. Under his leadership, it exploded. By the mid-2000s, New Birth claimed more than 25,000 attendees, sprawling across 250 acres of manicured grounds. It was one of the largest black megachurches in America. Long's style was magnetic, bold, theatrical, and unapologetically prosperous. He spoke of kingdom living, the idea that God wanted believers to be successful, rich, and powerful. He wore custom suits, diamond cufflinks, and drove Bentleys, insisting that abundance was proof of divine favor. His sermons blended scripture with motivational language. "We are kings," he would roar from the pulpit, "and we will not live like beggars." The message resonated in an era of ambition and self-help. Celebrities, athletes, and politicians attended his services. President George W. Bush invited him to the White House. The media hailed him as a bridge between conservative Christianity and African-American empowerment. Yet even as Long built his empire, rumors whispered through Atlanta. Some former members complained about his authoritarian control, his insistence on loyalty, and his inner circle of young male assistants. Protégés who traveled with him, lived in his homes, and called him Dad. Long dismissed the talk as jealousy. But by 2010, the whispers erupted into national scandal. That September, 4 young men, Anthony Flagg, Maurice Robinson, Jamal Paris, and Spencer Legrand, filed civil lawsuits against Long, accusing him of sexual coercion. They alleged that beginning when they were teenagers in his congregation, Long had used his influence, gifts, and spiritual authority to groom them into sexual relationships. According to court filings, he took them on lavish trips: Paris, Kenya, New Zealand. bought them cars, jewelry, and cash gifts, and justified the encounters as spiritual fatherhood. The boys described private covenant ceremonies where Long presented them with scriptures, rings, and pledges of loyalty. For years they had remained silent, fearful of betraying a man revered by their families and community. But as they matured, the psychological toll became unbearable. Their lawsuits painted a portrait not of a pastor, but of a predator cloaked in holiness. The news detonated like a bomb across the religious world. Members of New Birth wept openly on camera. Others denied the accusations outright, insisting their bishop was being targeted because of his race, his success, and his conservative stance on homosexuality. The irony was impossible to ignore. Only a few years earlier, Long had led public marches against same-sex marriage, calling it spiritual warfare. Now he was accused of exploiting young men under the same roof where he had preached purity. When the story broke, Long appeared before his congregation. More than 10,000 people filled the sanctuary, some waving signs that read, "We stand with you." Wearing a gray suit and clutching his Bible, he addressed the crowd in a trembling voice. "I have never in my life portrayed myself as a perfect man," he said. "But this thing, I'm going to fight." He denied the allegations but refused to answer specific questions. "We've got 5 rocks," he added, referencing the biblical David facing Goliath. "And I haven't thrown one yet." The crowd erupted in applause. Outside the church, however, the reaction was colder. Investigators from DeKalb County and the FBI began reviewing financial records and travel expenses. Reporters uncovered evidence that church funds had paid for some of the trips and gifts cited in the lawsuits. Prosecutors struggled to build a criminal case. Georgia's statutes at the time made it difficult to prosecute sexual acts between adults, even if they began with manipulation when one party was underage. But the civil suits continued. In May 2011, Long quietly settled all 4 cases out of court for an estimated $24 million. The settlement included non-disclosure agreements, ensuring that none of the accusers could speak publicly about the details. Officially, Long admitted no wrongdoing. But the damage was done. Membership at New Birth plummeted. Donations collapsed. The once booming ministry that had hosted major conferences and concerts now faced foreclosure on parts of its property. Behind the scenes, Long's personal life was unraveling as well. His wife Vanessa filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, though she later withdrew the petition temporarily before finalizing it years later. Within the church, factions formed, those who still believed in his innocence and those who saw betrayal. Some staff resigned, unable to reconcile the allegations with the man they had served. Despite the scandal, Long refused to step aside. He returned to the pulpit, thinner but defiant, insisting that God had forgiven him and that he was still called to lead. His sermons took on a defensive tone, less about prosperity and more about endurance through persecution. He spoke of spiritual warfare and Jezebel spirits trying to destroy his ministry. Loyal followers cheered. Critics saw manipulation. In later years, Long's health began to decline. Photographs of his once muscular frame now showed a gaunt figure, prompting speculation about illness. He denied rumors of AIDS, calling them evil lies, and insisted he was undergoing a vegan diet to cleanse his body. But in January 2017, New Birth Missionary Baptist Church announced that Bishop Eddie Long had died at age 63 after a gallant private fight with an aggressive cancer. The announcement drew mixed emotions. Thousands attended his funeral, celebrating his early achievements and charitable work. Yet outside, survivors and critics held vigils of their own, reminding the public of the unresolved trauma his accusers still carried. No criminal charges were ever filed, and the settlements ensured the evidence would never be fully aired in court. In the aftermath, the church struggled to recover. Membership continued to fall, and questions about financial transparency persisted. In time, new leadership attempted to rebuild trust, rebranding New Birth as a community-focused ministry rather than a monument to one man. But the scars remained. For many former members, Long's fall was not just a betrayal of morality. It was the collapse of a spiritual identity. Sociologists studying the case saw it as a textbook example of charismatic authority gone unchecked. In megachurch culture, the pastor often becomes both spiritual leader and celebrity CEO, insulated by adoration and wealth. Long had built an ecosystem where questioning him was seen as rebellion against God. That psychological control, coupled with religious guilt, allowed abuse to flourish unseen. The story of Eddie Long is haunting precisely because of its complexity. He was not a caricature of evil, but a man shaped by ambition, talent, and the seductive feedback loop of power and praise. He inspired genuine faith and did real good for some, scholarships, outreach programs, and community projects, but he also exploited that same faith to feed personal desires. His death left behind two legacies: the visible one of buildings and sermons, and the hidden one of broken trust and silenced pain. Years later, documentaries and news retrospectives still revisit the case. Former followers described the moment they realized the mask had slipped, the sermons that now sounded hollow, the hugs that felt performative, the sense of betrayal that lingered even after forgiveness was preached. They speak of learning to separate God from the man who claimed to represent him. Reflection. Eddie Long's story forces the audience to confront the danger of unchecked spiritual authority. It reveals how easily devotion can become dependency, and how power disguised as mentorship can destroy lives. The mask he wore was one of holiness and leadership, but behind it lay manipulation and secrecy. His downfall reminds viewers that true faith does not demand blind loyalty. It demands truth, even when that truth dismantles the empire of a king. Tony Alamo was born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in 1934 in Joplin, Missouri, a restless, sharp-eyed boy who would grow into one of America's most notorious cult preachers. From the beginning, he believed he was destined for greatness. By his teens, he had left home to chase fame in California, hoping to become a pop singer. He recorded a few songs under different names, drifted through nightclubs, and mixed with small-time promoters. Fame never arrived, but when he discovered the emotional magnetism of religion, how words could command money and loyalty, he found something far more powerful than applause. In 1966, while wandering the streets of Hollywood, he met a woman named Edith Opal Horn, known as Susan. She was fiery, charismatic, and deeply religious, convinced that America was collapsing under sin. Together they founded a street ministry aimed at saving the lost souls of the hippie generation. They called it Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation. At first it seemed genuine, a husband and wife team preaching repentance to drug addicts and runaways. They offered food, shelter, and the promise of spiritual rebirth. But behind that image, Tony and Susan were building a machine of control. The Alamos set up shop in an old Hollywood building. As their following grew, so did their demands. Members were required to give up their possessions, cut ties with families, and work long hours in foundation-run businesses. Tony taught that obedience to him was obedience to God. Susan, who claimed to receive direct revelations from the Lord, enforced his rules with fear and guilt. Together, they were the perfect duet. He was the showman, she the prophetess. By the early 1970s, the Alamos relocated their headquarters to Dyer, Arkansas. They bought hundreds of acres of land and built a commune surrounded by barbed wire and guard dogs. Followers lived in cramped dorms, labored in sweatshop-like conditions, and attended hours-long sermons each day. Those who questioned the leadership were beaten, publicly humiliated, or expelled with nothing. Tony's preaching grew darker, filled with visions of apocalypse and persecution. He claimed that the U.S. government was controlled by Satan, and that anyone who opposed him was of the devil. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, the Alamos amassed wealth. Their followers operated printing businesses, clothing factories, and mail-order operations. They produced ornate, rhinestone-covered denim jackets that became fashionable in Hollywood circles. Celebrities like Dolly Parton and Mick Jagger reportedly bought them. Every dollar went through Tony's hands. None went to the workers. The preacher who railed against materialism was now living in mansions and driving Cadillacs. When Susan died of cancer in 1982, Tony's sermons took a stranger turn. He insisted that her body was incorruptible, that she would rise from the dead. For 6 months, her embalmed corpse lay in a glass coffin inside their Arkansas compound while members were forced to pray for her resurrection. When the body finally began to decay, Tony shifted the story. God had taken Susan's spirit into heaven but left Tony as her divine successor. With his wife gone, his rule became absolute. Under his leadership, the Alamo Foundation devolved from a strict ministry into a nightmare of abuse. Followers were beaten for minor disobedience. Parents who defied Tony's orders had their children taken away. Former members later described how Alamo used scripture to justify every cruelty. He quoted verses about obedience, submission, and divine authority to silence resistance. He controlled marriages, money, and even the most personal aspects of life: what members ate, when they slept, and who they could speak to. By the 1990s, federal authorities began closing in. Former followers had fled the compound, filing lawsuits alleging physical abuse, child labor, and financial exploitation. In 1994, Alamo was convicted of tax evasion. He had failed to report millions of dollars in income from church businesses. He served 4 years in prison. Many assumed his ministry would collapse in his absence. But even behind bars, Alamo maintained control through letters, recorded messages, and loyal lieutenants who kept the Arkansas commune running. After his release in 1998, Alamo returned more paranoid than ever. He declared that the government and the Vatican were conspiring to destroy him. His sermons, now broadcast over shortwave radio and cassette tapes, ranted about global conspiracies, demons, and the persecution of true believers. He expanded operations into Tennessee and Oklahoma, setting up new compounds that doubled as sweatshops. Children worked long hours sewing garments and packing merchandise. Members' paychecks were confiscated for God's work. But the most horrifying secrets were yet to surface. In 2008, the FBI raided Alamo's compound in Fuke, Arkansas, after multiple reports of child sexual abuse. The accusations came from former members, young girls who said Alamo had forced them into marriages when they were as young as 8. Investigators found detailed records of these so-called spiritual unions, along with testimony that Alamo justified them using biblical passages about Old Testament patriarchs taking multiple wives. One victim recounted how he would call her to his room late at night under the guise of prayer, then abuse her. Another described being isolated from her family and told that she was honored to be chosen as one of God's brides. Several girls were taken across state lines to attend Alamo's rallies or live in other compounds, violating federal trafficking laws. During the trial, prosecutors presented evidence that was almost too disturbing to read aloud. Witnesses described years of brainwashing and violence. Parents who resisted had their children taken away and beaten. Some testified that Alamo ordered guards to discipline teenagers with wooden boards and electric cords. Others recalled how he made young girls dress in wedding gowns for ceremonies. In July 2009, a federal jury found Tony Alamo guilty on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sexual purposes. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively life without parole. U.S. District Judge Harry Barnes told him, "Mr. Alamo, one day you will face a higher judge than me, and may he have mercy on your soul." As the verdict was read, Alamo showed no remorse. He smiled faintly and declared the trial a setup by the Catholic Church. His remaining followers stood outside the courthouse singing hymns and holding signs that read, "Free God's Servant Tony," inside prison. He continued to write letters proclaiming his innocence, calling himself a martyr. He died behind bars in 2017 at the age of 82. Even after his death, the aftermath of his empire lingered. Dozens of former members filed civil suits against the Alamo ministries, alleging years of forced labor and psychological trauma. In 2014, A federal judge awarded $525 million in damages to 7 survivors of abuse, the largest civil judgment in Arkansas history. The funds were largely symbolic. The foundation's assets were seized and sold off to compensate victims. The once bustling compound in Fuke fell silent, its buildings abandoned and overgrown. Forensic psychologists who studied the Alamo case described it as a textbook example of religious coercive control, a system in which faith becomes both weapon and shield. Alamo convinced followers that obedience to him was salvation and disobedience was damnation. The result was total domination of thought, labor, sexuality, and even identity. Survivors spoke of needing years of therapy to overcome the guilt and fear instilled in them. To this day, remnants of his teachings circulate online through small extremist sects claiming to preserve Pastor Tony's truth. They continue to denounce the government, mainstream churches, and even other evangelicals. It is a chilling reminder that the echoes of charismatic manipulation rarely die with the manipulator. For those who escaped, recovery has been slow but defiant. Many have reunited with family members long cut off by the cult. Some have become advocates for victims of religious abuse, speaking at conferences and pushing for stronger oversight of faith-based organizations. Their stories expose the dangerous intersection of blind faith and unchecked authority. Tony Alamo's legacy is one of pain disguised as prophecy. He called himself a preacher of truth, but he built his kingdom on deception and cruelty. He claimed to save souls, but he destroyed childhoods. And he wrapped it all in the holy language of salvation. His story is a grim warning of what happens when spiritual power becomes absolute, when a man begins to see himself not as God's servant, but as his replacement. Reflection. Tony Alamo's life demonstrates how charisma and fear can transform faith into tyranny. His empire began as a mission of compassion and ended as a monument to abuse. He wore his religion like armor, deflecting criticism and justice until the truth finally tore through the mask. Behind the holy curtain lay something hollow, monstrous, and all too human, the hunger for control disguised as divine love. In the high desert of southern Utah, amid red cliffs and dusty roads, stands a place once believed to be holy ground, the twin border towns of Hilldale, Utah, and Colorado City, Arizona. For nearly a century, these quiet streets were ruled by a faith that preached eternal marriage and obedience to God's chosen prophet. At its center stood one man, Warren Steed Jeffs, who declared himself the voice of God on earth. To outsiders, he looked like a soft-spoken preacher in a conservative suit. To his followers, he was a living bridge to heaven. But beneath the serene facade was a web of control, corruption, and abuse that would unravel into one of the most disturbing criminal cases in American religious history. Warren Jeffs was born in 1955, the son of Rulon Jeffs, leader of the Fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, FLDS, a breakaway sect that had split from mainstream Mormonism in the early 20th century to continue the practice of polygamy. From birth, Warren was groomed to inherit power. His father, known to followers as Uncle Rulon, commanded absolute obedience. Members believed he spoke directly to God, deciding who could marry, where they could live, and even which children were righteous enough to attend school. Warren grew up in a world of strict separation from the outside. The FLDS taught that outsiders were Gentiles sent by Satan to persecute God's chosen people. Women wore long dresses and braided hair. Men worked in construction and ranching under church-run companies. Everything revolved around the prophet's word. And in the shadows, that word became law. When Rulon Jeffs grew old and frail in the 1990s, Warren, one of his many sons, began to assume control. He managed the church's private schools and served as his father's spokesman. Teachers described him as cold, authoritarian, and obsessed with purity. He enforced harsh punishments for sins as small as listening to worldly music or questioning authority. Girls who disobeyed modesty rules were humiliated publicly. Boys who showed defiance were expelled from the community, cast out into a world they were taught to fear. When Rulon died in 2002, Warren declared himself his father's divine successor. In a chilling speech, he told followers that, "The prophet speaks from beyond the veil through me." He announced new commandments. Only he could perform marriages, assign homes, and determine salvation. Within months, dissenters were purged. Families were torn apart. Those deemed unworthy were exiled. Their wives and children reassigned to other men deemed more righteous. Overnight, Warren Jeffs became not just a preacher, but a total ruler. At the heart of his theology was polygamy, the belief that men must take multiple wives to attain eternal glory. Jeffs took this doctrine to extremes. As prophet, he held the power to choose every union, often marrying teenage girls to older men or claiming young brides for himself. Some were as young as 12. He told them it was God's will, that resisting him meant eternal damnation. Parents were coerced into surrendering their daughters, believing they were offering them to heaven. Under Jeffs, the FLDS expanded its control over property, finances, and daily life. Members worked long hours in church-owned businesses without pay, convinced their labor was a sacrifice for God. They lived in communal homes, their possessions owned by the United Effort Plan, a trust managed by Jeffs. If anyone disobeyed, they could be evicted overnight, losing everything. He banned television, the internet, and contact with outsiders. Radios were confiscated. Children were taught that law enforcement and media were agents of Satan. To outsiders, the towns of Hilldale and Colorado City seemed peaceful. Neat houses, clean streets, and quiet families. But behind the closed doors of the sprawling compounds, unimaginable crimes were taking place. Jeffs maintained a secret recording system capturing his sermons, marriage sealings, and private sessions. Those tapes, recovered years later, revealed the horrifying reality. The prophet was using religion as a front for sexual abuse. He declared that sexual purity sessions with him were divine instruction. Survivors later described being summoned at night, told to undress, and assaulted under the guise of spiritual testing. He recorded many of these encounters, calling them heavenly sessions. Some victims were barely teenagers. One was just 12 years old when Jeffs took her as his spiritual wife. In his private writings, he described himself as the Holy Spirit in the flesh. As Jeffs tightened his grip, his paranoia deepened. He built secret compounds in Texas, South Dakota, and Colorado, safe havens for what he called God's chosen remnant. In 2003, under growing scrutiny from Utah authorities, he fled the state. For 3 years, he lived as a fugitive, moving between safe houses provided by loyal followers. The FBI added him to its 10 most wanted list, charging him with sexual assault and unlawful flight. Despite the national manhunt, he continued to send recorded sermons to his flock, instructing them to remain faithful and prepare for the apocalypse. In August 2006, police finally caught him during a traffic stop outside Las Vegas. He was found in a red Cadillac Escalade filled with wigs, cash, and 16 cell phones. Inside his briefcase was a list of heavenly wives, some of them underage. He was arrested without resistance, his expression calm, almost serene. The trial that followed revealed horrors that stunned even veteran investigators. Prosecutors played recordings of Jeffs performing so-called wedding ceremonies with children, instructing them to submit in obedience to the Lord. They presented DNA evidence linking him to a 15-year-old girl who had given birth to his child. His voice, captured in chilling audio, could be heard praying as he assaulted her. "This is God's work," he murmured. In 2007, Jeffs was convicted in Utah of being an accomplice to rape and sentenced to 10 years in prison. The conviction was later overturned on a technicality, but the following year, Texas authorities launched a massive raid on his yearning for Zion Ranch near El Dorado. Acting on a tip about child brides, police discovered hundreds of women and children living in strict isolation. They found hidden safes, coded marriage records, and a temple where Jeffs conducted his secret sealings. More than 400 children were temporarily removed from the compound. In 2011, Jeffs was convicted in Texas on 2 counts of child sexual assault. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA tests, recordings, and testimony from victims. The jury took less than 4 hours to find him guilty. The judge sentenced him to life plus 20 years in prison. During the sentencing, Jeffs remained expressionless. When asked if he had anything to say, he warned the courtroom that God will send a scourge upon the land for imprisoning his prophet. Even from behind bars, Jeffs continued to control his followers. He sent letters and phone messages dictating who could marry, who could speak, and what sermons to preach. He excommunicated dissenters and declared that salvation could only come through him. Some members mortgaged their homes to send money to his prison account. Others starved themselves, believing his imprisonment was a divine test. In time, cracks began to form in the empire. State authorities seized control of the church's trust properties and redistributed them to former members. Many women fled the community, taking their children with them. Support groups and shelters sprang up across Utah and Arizona to help survivors rebuild their lives. Slowly, the walls of secrecy began to crumble. For those who escaped, healing came slowly. Many had never attended public school, used a phone, or spoken to people outside the sect. Some struggled with guilt, fearing that leaving meant damnation. Others found strength in sharing their stories. Their testimonies exposed how one man used the language of heaven to justify the deepest violations of humanity. Today, Warren Jeffs remains incarcerated in a Texas state prison. His followers, though fractured, still number in the thousands. Some continue to revere him as a prophet. Others have renounced him as a fraud. But even from confinement, his shadow lingers. Recorded messages periodically surface online, his voice monotone, warning of apocalypse, promising deliverance to those who remain faithful. The towns of Hilldale and Colorado City are slowly rebuilding, but the scars are deep. Streets once patrolled by FLDS enforcers now host schools, shops, and local elections for the first time in decades. Yet the silence of those who suffered under Jeffs' rule is a reminder of what can happen when devotion replaces conscience and obedience replaces truth. Reflection. The story of Warren Jeffs is not only about one man's crimes. It is about the danger of faith without accountability. It is a chilling portrait of how absolute authority can corrupt absolutely, even under the banner of God. He claimed to lead souls to heaven, but instead built a prison of fear. And behind the prophet's mask was not divinity, but domination. A man who believed he could rewrite the will of God, and for a time made thousands believe it too. In the bustling suburbs of Dallas, Texas, a gleaming television studio stands as a symbol of both devotion and deception. Cameras roll, bright lights illuminate a sea of worshipers, and at the center is Robert Tilton, a man whose booming voice and commanding presence drew millions into his orbit. Tilton was a master of the Televangelist era, preaching a message of faith, prosperity, and divine favor, while orchestrating one of the most audacious schemes in modern religious history. Behind the smiles, prayer lines, and promises of miracles lay a world of manipulation, greed, and exploitation, and the story would shock viewers across America. Born in 1946 in Chicago, Illinois, Robert Tilton grew up in a modest household, attending church but struggling academically and socially. His early life offered little promise of the empire he would eventually build, yet he discovered his gift, the ability to move people with words. By his 20s, he was preaching in small churches across the Midwest, demonstrating a knack for storytelling, charisma, and persuasion. Congregations were drawn to his energy and confidence, seeing in him a man who could bridge the gap between heaven and earth. Tilton's rise to fame began in the late 1970s. Capitalizing on the rapidly expanding world of cable television, he launched a small broadcast that aired in Texas and nearby states. The show, later known as Success and Life, mixed religious sermons with testimonies of miraculous healings, personal transformation, and promises of wealth for the faithful. He preached the prosperity gospel, a doctrine asserting that God rewards faith and financial giving with health, success, and material blessings. His methods were meticulously calculated. Tilton encouraged viewers to send in seed offerings, donations ranging from small tithes to significant sums, with the promise that God would return blessings multiplied many times over. He presented himself as a conduit for divine wealth, telling his audience that faith without action, particularly financial action, was meaningless. Letters poured in from across the country, accompanied by checks, money orders, and sometimes even cash hidden in envelopes. By the 1980s, Tilton had constructed a sprawling compound in Dallas, complete with a production studio, administrative offices, and a network of call centers that processed donations and correspondence. Thousands of employees worked under him, many of them volunteers, faithfully executing the daily operations of the ministry. Tilton's presence on television was omnipresent. Sermons, interviews, infomercials, and even personal appeals during broadcasts. Viewers were captivated by his energy, charisma, and apparent authenticity. But behind the cameras, Tilton's empire operated with ruthless efficiency and moral compromise. Investigations later revealed that he routinely discarded prayer requests, shredded letters, and manipulated testimonies to make it appear that God was rewarding loyal donors. Television segments showing miraculous healings were often staged, using actors or carefully edited clips to suggest divine intervention. His staff were instructed to create an illusion of spiritual authority and success while maximizing financial intake. The turning point came in 1991 when Inside Edition, an investigative news program, broadcast a damning exposé. Hidden cameras caught Tilton instructing followers to send money as proof of faith, while staff shredded letters from people asking for prayers, including desperate pleas for the sick and dying. The footage showed Tilton preaching with fervor, promising divine rewards in exchange for financial offerings, all while behind the scenes, prayers went unanswered. The scandal ignited a national conversation. How could a man claiming to speak for God exploit so many for profit? The exposé led to federal investigations. Tilton faced scrutiny from the IRS, the Federal Trade Commission, and state authorities for deceptive solicitation, misuse of funds, and tax irregularities. Court documents revealed that millions of dollars in donations had been diverted for personal gain, luxurious living, and extravagant television productions. Tilton owned multiple properties, luxury vehicles, and a lavish lifestyle funded by the faith and generosity of his followers. Yet Tilton retained a core of devoted supporters. He insisted that the allegations were attacks by a jealous world against a man of God. In interviews, he framed himself as a servant of divine providence, a messenger misunderstood by skeptics. "I am doing the Lord's work," he declared, "and the people who oppose it are blind to his power." Despite mounting legal pressure, Tilton continued broadcasting, often with the same unshakable confidence that had built his empire. The scandal took a personal toll on many of his followers. People who had given life savings, homes, and retirement funds to the ministry found themselves financially ruined. Some had mortgaged property multiple times to comply with Tilton's appeals. Emotional and spiritual trauma compounded the material losses. Families were fractured, faith shaken, and communities left grappling with betrayal. The juxtaposition of Tilton's messages of blessing with the suffering of his followers created a powerful symbol of religious exploitation. Tilton faced multiple lawsuits, both civil and criminal. Some settlements were paid quietly, further fueling allegations of concealment and moral corruption. Critics called him a televangelist con man, while supporters insisted that God's work could not be understood by outsiders. The debate over his guilt, morality, and spiritual legitimacy raged across media outlets, church pulpits, and living rooms. By the late 1990s, Tilton's influence had waned. Cable television slots diminished, donor lists shrank, and public perception soured. He continued preaching sporadically, maintaining a small but dedicated following. Investigators noted that his ability to exploit faith had left lasting scars on both individual lives and the wider televangelist movement. The case became a cautionary tale, prompting discussions about transparency, accountability, and ethics in religious broadcasting. Tilton's story, however, did not end in total disgrace. In later years, he attempted a revival, focusing on online broadcasts, small congregations, and motivational speaking. While his methods were less grandiose, the pattern remained familiar, blending spiritual promises with personal authority, appealing to hope, and leveraging trust. Though he never regained the national prominence he once enjoyed, Tilton's name remains synonymous with the complex interplay of faith, ambition, and moral compromise. Reflection. Robert Tilton's rise and fall is a stark illustration of how charisma and religious authority can be weaponized for personal gain. He preached salvation, prosperity, and divine favor while exploiting the vulnerable. His story challenges the audience to question not just the man behind the mask, but the systems that allow unchecked power within spiritual institutions. Faith, when manipulated, becomes a tool of deception, and the divine mask, no matter how radiant, can hide the most human of failings. In the glossy skyline of Seattle, Washington, stands a gleaming glass and steel building, the home of Mars Hill Church, once the epicenter of one of America's fastest-growing megachurch movements. Inside, thousands gathered every weekend to hear the voice of Mark Driscoll, a man whose sermons combined theology, humor, and raw intensity. To his followers, he was a spiritual warrior, a bold defender of biblical truth. To outsiders, he was charismatic, controversial, and ambitious. But beneath the bravado lay a pattern of control, intimidation, and abuse that would eventually unravel a powerful empire of faith. Mark Driscoll was born in 1970 in Grand Forks, North Dakota. Raised in a military family, he moved frequently and developed an early sense of discipline and authority. A deeply religious household instilled in him an appreciation for Scripture, and by high school he was already preaching in local youth groups. After attending Seattle Pacific University and then Western Seminary, he began teaching and ministering in small congregations. Early in his career, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to connect with young adults, particularly men, through direct, no-nonsense messages about sin, masculinity, and personal responsibility. In 1996, Driscoll founded Mars Hill Church in Seattle with just a few dozen members. His approach was different from the soft-spoken preaching style of many pastors. He preached with energy, humor, and aggression. He championed what he called biblical manhood, encouraging men to be strong, assertive, and unapologetically dominant in their households. Sermons were often confrontational, mixing theology with pop culture references, personal anecdotes, and challenges to the congregation to live morally disciplined lives. This style attracted young professionals, students, and families hungry for clarity and authority in their faith. By the early 2000s, Mars Hill had expanded rapidly. Multiple campuses, thousands of attendees, and a robust online presence made Driscoll a prominent figure in evangelical circles. His books sold millions, and his social media influence grew, blending traditional ministry with modern marketing. Driscoll's charisma, intelligence, and confidence cemented him as a leader who seemed larger than life. He became a voice for conservative evangelicalism, speaking on national stages about morality, culture, and faith. However, as Mars Hill grew, so did the culture of secrecy and fear behind the scenes. Former members and employees would later reveal that Driscoll maintained tight control over the church's internal operations. Church staff reported a climate of intimidation, harsh criticism, public shaming, and threats of termination for questioning leadership decisions. Young pastors and volunteers were told to submit unquestioningly, and dissenters were marginalized or removed. Decisions about finances, staffing, and church direction were centralized in Driscoll's hands, often without consultation or transparency. In 2014, the first public cracks began to appear. Investigative reports and leaked documents revealed that Driscoll had engaged in aggressive online tactics to silence critics. Dozens of pseudonymous posts on forums and blogs were traced back to him and his associates, often attacking detractors personally, questioning their faith, and accusing them of deceit. These actions painted a portrait of a leader more concerned with reputation than accountability. Simultaneously, multiple former employees came forward with allegations of verbal abuse and intimidation. Staff members described public tirades, belittlement, and manipulation that created a toxic work environment. Women in leadership roles were particularly affected, facing barriers, harassment, and dismissal if they failed to conform to Driscoll's vision of gender roles. While some defended him as a passionate pastor holding high standards, others recognized a pattern of authoritarianism that crossed ethical and spiritual boundaries. Financially, questions arose about transparency and stewardship. Mars Hill had become a multi-million-dollar organization, funded by tithes, donations, and book sales. Critics alleged that oversight was minimal and that Driscoll's control over expenditures was absolute. A culture of unquestioning loyalty enabled lavish spending, with limited accountability to the congregation. Reports suggested that staff were pressured to contribute personally, fund marketing campaigns, or participate in initiatives that benefited the leadership disproportionately. The culmination of these pressures led to a watershed moment in 2014. The elders of Mars Hill commissioned an internal review, prompted by widespread public criticism and internal complaints. The results were damning. Driscoll was found to have violated the church's own policies, engaged in unbiblical conduct regarding leadership treatment of staff, and fostered a culture that prioritized image over spiritual integrity. He faced an ultimatum: resign or be removed. Facing mounting pressure, media scrutiny, and dwindling support, Mark Driscoll resigned as pastor in October 2014. His departure was accompanied by the collapse of Mars Hill Church, which disbanded shortly afterward. Thousands of members left. Campuses closed, and former leaders sought new spiritual homes or counseling. Driscoll maintained that he had been unfairly treated and that critics misunderstood his intentions, but for many, the damage to the church's reputation and spiritual health was irreversible. The fallout extended beyond the congregation. Evangelical leaders debated the implications of Driscoll's leadership style, raising difficult questions about accountability, authoritarianism, and the dangers of personality-driven ministries. Scholars highlighted the risk of charismatic leaders consolidating power in ways that can harm staff, congregants, and communities. Driscoll became a case study in how success, fame, and faith can be manipulated to control and intimidate others, even when the outward appearance is devoted to spiritual growth. Today, Mark Driscoll continues to minister in smaller, independent settings, writing books and preaching online. His followers remain devoted, but the shadow of Mars Hill lingers, serving as a cautionary tale. Former members recount the psychological and spiritual scars, describing years of self-doubt, fear, and confusion as they struggled to reconcile the charisma they loved with the control they endured. Counseling, reflection, and public advocacy for accountability became a path to healing for many. Reflection. Mark Driscoll's story is not one of clear-cut villainy, but of the subtle dangers inherent in unchecked authority within religious institutions. Charisma, energy, and bold preaching can inspire millions. Yet without accountability, the same gifts can mask manipulation and harm. Behind the public persona of spiritual leadership lies a lesson about vigilance. Faith must never be monopolized, and devotion should never excuse abuse. The pastor's mask, once shining brightly, can conceal shadows that persist long after the sermon's end. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.